Welcome to the Protein Food Safety System Basic Training that's presented by AAMP Outreach. This presentation is focused on laying a foundation of understanding of the different parts of a food safety system, including hazard analyses, HACCP plans, SSOPs, and other programs like prerequisite programs and good manufacturing practices programs. Note, this presentation is meant to aid in in-house training of employees in a meat and/or poultry production facility, as well as provide a student the basic understanding of a food safety system. This course is not certified by the HACCP Alliance and cannot be used as an official HACCP certification. However, having employees take this course can count as internal employee training. This presentation is meant for a person to review and walk away with an understanding of food safety terminology and definitions, the history of HACCP and who regulates the implementation, the basic components of food safety systems, the basic components of specific procedures and regulatory requirements, and the 7 HACCP principles. On the screen here, we're going to review a few of the definitions and acronyms that we are going to discuss and utilize throughout this presentation. Cleaning, the physical removal of soil and/or food residues from a surface. Sanitizing, a treatment of a surface that has been previously cleaned to reduce the number of microorganisms. Next acronym is pronounced HACCP, which is the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point Plan. CCP stands for Critical Control Point. SSOP stands for Sanitation Standard Operating Procedures. SOP stands for Standard Operating Procedures. GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practices. USDA is the United States Department of Agriculture. FSIS is the Food Safety and Inspection Service. FDA stands for the Food and Drug Administration. And the final acronym on this slide is CFR, which stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. Don't worry about knowing what all of these are right now. We will review them on subsequent slides. So there's a lot of groundwork we are laying on this slide. First, let's talk about the difference between food safety systems and HACCP plans. Many people use these terms interchangeably, however, they are not the same thing. Food safety systems include the HACCP plan, the hazard analysis, food defense plans, prerequisite programs, GMPs, humane handling programs, etc., etc. So a HACCP plan is part of a food safety system, but a food safety system is not interchangeable terminology with a HACCP plan. Food safety systems are documented processes and procedures with records built and implemented to ensure public safety hazards are controlled in the harvest and processing environment. These documents are created to reduce, eliminate, or prevent hazards in a production and processing environment. That brings up the question, what is a hazard? Well, a hazard is anything in a food production environment that can cause disease, illness, or injury in humans by way of food. As discussed, the food safety system includes things like HACCP plans, hazard analyses, good manufacturing practices, prerequisite programs, etc. HACCP plans are required by regulation, whether a facility is regulated by the FDA, USDA, or local inspectors. And note that our presentation will be focusing on USDA regulated products, and USDA enforces most of their regulations out of the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically 9 CFR. On the screen here, you will see that there are many components that can make up food safety plans. We are going to be walking through each of these in the subsequent slides. Note that while we are going to review these, some of these programs will not be applicable to every facility. SSOPs, or Sanitation Standard Operating Procedures, are written procedures that an establishment or facility develops and implements that is made to prevent direct contamination or adulteration of product during production and storage from employees and the environment. These written procedures are created to ensure that production of meat and poultry products is completed in an environment free from situations that could contaminate or adulterate a food source. These procedures typically include a description of procedures to clean and sanitize equipment, walls, floors, ceilings, and personal processing tools, as well as procedures for employee hygiene and what practices are allowed and not allowed on the processing floor, and finally, descriptions of how these procedures will be documented and recorded. If you would like to look up the specific code section for SSOPs in relation to USDA FSIS regulatory information, this is 9 CFR Part 416. On to SOPs, which stands for Standard Operating Procedures. These are different than SSOPs because they typically outline the steps for an employee to complete a task. These tasks are not typically directly related to food safety. Examples of SOPs are deconstruction and reconstruction of a grinder, deconstruction and reconstruction of a captive bolt stunner, how to grease specific equipment, or other preventative maintenance items. Mixing formulations sometimes may also be an SOP instead of a different program. SOPs definitely support food safety plans, and they can be a part of them, but they are not typically. Good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, and prerequisite programs, sometimes called PRPs, are programs that support the HACCP plan and hazard analyses, which we will talk about on the next slide. These programs identify how specific hazards that are not critical will be controlled in and around the production environment. Some examples of these are receiving programs, employee training programs, a storage program, a procedure to outline sanitary dressing procedures in slaughter establishments, sampling programs like E. coli or Listeria, training programs, pest management programs, allergen management, and labeling programs. There is seemingly no end to these programs as each facility and hazards are different. Typically, when deciding if you are going to be building a prerequisite or a GMP program, you can think of this. GMPs are typically addressing practices in your facility, something like employee clothing and jewelry, mixing antimicrobial agents, etc. PRPs, or prerequisite programs, are more building and facility related. So something more like pest control, facility maintenance, things like that may have procedures developed. All right, so moving on to HACCP. HACCP is the big portion of this presentation. As we discussed, HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point. It is a risk management system that focuses on identification and control/prevention of hazards associated with the process. Food processors are ultimately responsible for the safety of their food products. Product testing cannot be the sole means of preventing foodborne illness. Note, testing doesn't necessarily equal safety, but that's a whole different topic. In the 1960s, PILLSBURY, NATICK Army Laboratory, and NASA collaborated and developed the first HACCP plan to ensure safe food for the first manned space flights. Originally, critical control points were used to test weapon and engineering systems. After successful implementation, PILLSBURY adopted HACCP in their company after a cereal they produced was found to contain glass pieces. Eventually, PILLSBURY created a training program that was given to FDA inspectors for canned food. Since then, HACCP has grown into a regulatory requirement across virtually all food processing facilities. There are 7 principles that are part of the HACCP process. They are listed here, and we will go into each one of these in depth. 1 is to conduct a hazard analysis. 2 is to identify critical control points. 3 is to establish critical limits for each critical control point. 4 is establish monitoring procedures. 5 is establish corrective actions. 6 is establish verification procedures. And 7 is establishing record-keeping procedures. Before implementing the 7 principles of HACCP, there are some things that need to be gathered before we can start. The first and very important pre-HACCP building item is to assemble the HACCP team. Then you will complete full product descriptions. Then we will complete a full product list. And finally, develop a flow diagram of steps in the process. So, not everyone in the HACCP team needs to be HACCP certified, but it's important to have employees on the HACCP team from all different parts of the business. It is more important to have a group that covers all areas of your business, so multidisciplinary. Examples of those that could serve on a HACCP team could be the food safety and quality manager, the production manager, an owner, a facility packaging manager, an office manager, maybe second-party consultants, or anyone that you may deem necessary to help carry out food safety at the facility. After the HACCP team is assembled, a full product list for each HACCP category should be developed. You can combine like products under the same HACCP plan. The example on the screen here is for raw intact meat products. So examples for a raw intact HACCP plan could be beef cuts, beef roasts, beef primals, beef carcasses, and it could go into other species as well, pork cuts, pork roasts, lamb cuts, lamb roasts, variety meats, etc., as long as the product is raw and intact. Other examples of HACCP categories are cured, fully cooked, not shelf-stable products like bacon, cottage bacon, or bone-in ham. Or there's a not heat-treated shelf-stable HACCP plan like dry-cured salami. There are many HACCP category types. It's just diagnosing what product you're producing at your facility and identifying what category those products fit into. Next, you and your team will want to complete a full list of the finished products that you are going to produce and create full product descriptions for them. So, identify the names of the products, the nature of the product, like is it fresh, frozen, or shelf-stable. Identify how the product is to be used or prepared, so raw and needs cooked to temp, or if it's ready to eat and be consumed as is. Also, identify what the shelf life is of the product and if it needs stored at a certain temperature for that time frame. As far as chemicals go, anything on the label, cleaning supplies or sanitizers used on equipment used in processing or processing aids, etc. Maybe identify how the product will be packaged. Typically, this is vacuum packaging or butcher wrap paper. Identify if you have specific labeling instructions. So an example is validated cooking instructions on tenderized beef steaks. Identify where the product will be sold, if it will be sold at retail, wholesale, restaurants, etc. Identify who the intended consumer is. So general use would be for normal healthy people or intended for infants, elderly, immunocompromised. If there are any specific distribution controls for the product, list those out. So examples of this would be to keep the product refrigerated or frozen. And finally, identify any important product characteristics that have not been identified at this time. Examples of this would be listing out a specific water activity that jerky is dehydrated to. After completing product descriptions, the next step is to build your flow diagram. The easiest way to do this is to physically walk through your facility and write down each processing step in order. As you can see on the screen here, the first step in this flow diagram is receiving materials and supplies. And then from there, the product can either move into product storage or move into dry storage. Don't forget when you are building these to take into account all pathways that product can go through. Flow diagrams typically start with receiving product and then end with shipping or sales as the last step. As noted on the screen, this is not a complete flow diagram. There are many more steps that need to be added for this flow diagram to be completed. All right. Now that the flow diagram is complete, we can move on to conducting a hazard analysis, which is principle 1 of the 7 principles of HACCP. So, a hazard analysis is the process of identifying all steps within a process and determining if there are any biological, chemical, physical, or radiological hazards associated with each step that are reasonably likely to occur based on location, process, equipment, raw materials, etc. Notice how we've underlined the verbiage reasonably likely to occur on the slide. This means that there is a very real chance that this hazard could occur. So, what does reasonably likely mean? So, for example, would you identify a natural disaster for like a tsunami as an event that is reasonably likely to occur in Nebraska? No. Further, would you identify salmonella as a hazard that is reasonably likely to occur at a raw meat product storage step? Yes, that hazard would be reasonably likely to occur. Note, if a hazard is identified as reasonably likely to occur in a process, then a CCP must be identified at that step or at subsequent steps to control that hazard. We will talk about CCPs more in depth later on. You can utilize plant history or use support like the 2018 Meat and Poultry Hazards Guide to help determine if something is reasonably likely to occur or not. Before we complete our hazard analysis, we must identify what would be included in the hazard groups we are looking at. The first group of hazards are the biological hazards. Biological hazards include viruses, molds, parasites, and bacteria. Bacterial hazards would include bacteria like Shiga toxin-producing E. coli, Salmonella enterica, Listeria monocytogenes, Staphylococcus aureus, and Campylobacter jejuni. Viral hazards would be something like norovirus. Parasitic hazards could be something like Trichinella spiralis in pork. Molds may be hazards as well. Prions, or altered proteins, may be hazards as well. Specifically on the screen are the prions related to BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or what is known as mad cow disease. Chemical hazards are the next group of hazards. Examples of chemical hazards could be residues from antibiotics given to the live animal, maybe cleaning chemicals in the facility, or restricted ingredients such as sodium nitrite, or even allergens. Allergens are considered to be a chemical hazard, and processing facilities that do process meat and poultry products that contain allergens typically have more controls in place with GMPs and other programs to control allergens as a hazard. There are 3 categories of chemical hazards that should be looked at when conducting a hazard analysis. So there's naturally occurring substances that may be present and inherent to the product or process. So this may be unavoidable and a tolerance level could be set. Examples are mycotoxins that are byproducts of mold or mercury in fish. Intentionally added chemical hazards would be added to the food process, but control must be exerted. Examples of intentionally added chemical hazards would be pesticides, antibiotics, preservatives, or processing aids. Finally, there's the unintentionally added chemicals, which are chemicals used in the facility but not meant to be present in the food. Examples of these would be lubricants and cleaning and sanitizing agents. The next group of hazards to address in a hazard analysis are physical hazards. Just as it sounds, these are physical items that are unwanted in the product that could cause injury to the persons consuming the product. Examples of physical hazards could be buckshot from live animals, maybe metal, glass, plastic, or wood, or what about stones or bone, depending on the product. It is important to visualize events that occur at each step to identify if physical hazards are reasonably likely to occur at that step. The decision to include physical hazards in the hazard analysis will depend on evaluation of the actual likelihood of occurrence and the severity of the hazard that it could present to consumers if it is present in the product. Potential sources of these physical hazards may come from the live animal, other raw materials like spices, or poorly designed or poorly maintained equipment, maybe improper procedures during production or cleaning, like not maintaining grinder plates or putting a stuffer together incorrectly, and also poor adherence to GMPs, like jewelry or Band-Aids in the product. Radiological hazards are the last group of hazards to review when conducting a hazard analysis. These are often overlooked and are rarely encountered, but when they are present, they do have a significant risk associated. Radiological hazards became a concern after nuclear power plant catastrophes. These hazards emit harmful radiation and are typically location dependent. What we mean by that is they would be more likely to occur if they are close to power plants or if they are in a geographic location higher in radiation. Examples of when these hazards would need to be considered would be uranium locations in Wyoming, or if a meat or poultry processing facility was located next to nuclear power plants. Now that we have discussed the different types of hazards and conducting a hazard analysis, we move on to Principle 2, which is identifying the critical control points and creating a HACCP plan. As a reminder, HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point. If having conducted your hazard analysis and identifying that hazards may be reasonably likely to occur, critical control points would need to be established. Critical control points, or CCPs, are a step or a point in the process that hazards can be eliminated, prevented, or reduced to safe levels. Example CCPs in meat processing could be storage temperatures, product temperatures, antimicrobial applications, water activity or pH for cooked products, among many, many others. The very important piece of information on this slide is this. If you cannot prevent, reduce, or eliminate a hazard at a specific step, then that step is not a critical control point. This decision tree is a valuable tool when identifying if steps are a critical control point. Question 1 states, does this step involve a hazard that is reasonably likely to occur and based on the severity warrants a control step? If the answer is no, then this step is not a CCP. But if the answer is yes, then we move on to question 2. At the end of the decision tree, you will have identified if the step you are working on needs to be a critical control point. It is recommended that you utilize this decision tree for each step in a process. Once critical control points are identified, we move on to Principle 3, which is to establish critical limits for each critical control point. A critical limit is a maximum or a minimum value to which a biological, chemical, or physical parameter must be controlled at a CCP to prevent, reduce, or eliminate hazards. Stated differently, the critical limit is a certain threshold that the product needs to stay within to ensure production control and food safety. These critical limits are typically established by using scientific documentation to support the limits. On the screen, you will see some specific examples for critical limits. Temperatures are used to hold product to control for specific biological concerns. Time, salt concentration, aroma or appearance, those also may be, and there's also many more limits that may be used to control hazards. Once critical limits are set, we now need to address Principle 4, which is to establish monitoring procedures. Principle 4 identifies a planned sequence of events on what is going to be monitored, who will be monitoring it, when the critical limit will be monitored, so that the CCPs and the CLs, or the critical limits, are implemented properly. It is important that all relevant staff are trained in these monitoring procedures. Examples of critical control points and critical limits to be monitored are time, temperature, humidity, water activity, which is the A subscript W on the screen, pH, and color. Note, just like all previous examples, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many other critical limits that we could add to this list. So now, once we have established monitoring procedures, we need to establish corrective actions, which means that in the event that a critical limit is not met and a failure is identified, we need to rectify the deviation or the issue. A corrective action identifies how the deviation has been brought back under control, which, said in another way, is how the problem was addressed and rectified. There are 4 parts to a HACCP corrective action. 1, identify the cause of the deviation and eliminate it. Identify how the CCP was brought back under control. Identify measures to prevent future reoccurrence. And finally, 4, ensure that no product that is injurious to health or that is otherwise adulterated as a result of this deviation enters commerce. A corrective action is not completed until all 4 parts are addressed and recorded. The next principle of HACCP, Principle 6, is establishing record-keeping procedures. Records are written evidence that an event occurred at an establishment. The way HACCP works is if a data point is not written down, there is no certainty that that data point actually happened. Many non-compliances are written due to missing records in a HACCP system, and if bad enough, product recalls can occur based on missing records. The big point here is that record keeping is incredibly vital to a HACCP and food safety system. Finally, we're moving on to Principle 7, which is establishing verification procedures. Verification procedures are steps that review and identify if the process will ultimately produce safe food for the final consumer. It can be confusing, but there are 2 parts to Principle 7, verification procedures. The first of these 2 parts is validation, and then the second is verification. We will talk about both in detail in the following slides. So, validation is the first part of Principle 6 of establishing verification procedures. Validation is the process where you are able to prove that all assumptions and support that has been built and made in the HACCP plan is correct and based on scientific fact to control food hazards in your process. The validation activities are typically completed after initial implementation of the food safety plan, but just after enough data has been collected, and then only every time a significant change is made to a HACCP system. The validation is typically completed in a 90-day window as required by FSIS regulation, but there are exceptions to this timeline, but we are not going to address them here. Second part to Principle 7 is verification procedures. These steps are typically completed after the validation is completed. These verification procedures are a periodic review or audit that reinforces that the HACCP system is still functioning as intended. Some of the tasks that were completed in the validation section of Principle 7 may be completed to establish verification procedures, or there may be different tasks completed during verification procedures. It is important for both verification and validation that those conducting the review process are properly trained to complete these tasks. If an item is overlooked and is a significant hazard, someone may be hurt or get sick. These verification procedures are ongoing and they do not end unless the HACCP system is no longer active at the facility. So we just wrapped up all principles of the HACCP, all 7 HACCP principles. Moving on, we're going to discuss some other information associated with HACCP plans. So a reminder from our definitions and acronyms screen that CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. These codes are where all federal regulations reside for meat and poultry processing. 9 CFR and 21 CFR are the 2 main regulatory codes in relation to meat processing. 9 CFR 417 is the regulation that addresses HACCP plans. This regulation states, every official establishment shall conduct or have conducted for it a hazard analysis to determine the food safety hazards reasonably likely to occur in the production process and identify the preventative measures the establishment can apply to control these hazards. The hazard analysis shall include food safety hazards that can occur before, during, and after entry into the establishment. A food safety hazard that is reasonably likely to occur is one for which a prudent establishment would establish controls because it historically has occurred, or because there is a reasonable possibility that it will occur in the particular type of product being processed in the absence of those controls. What this means is that each facility that processes meat or poultry under state or federal inspection must complete a hazard analysis, which we'll talk about shortly. If hazards are identified as reasonably likely to occur, then critical control points must be put in place, according to 9 CFR 417.2. Nine CFR 417.7b is the regulation that requires that the person completing a hazard analysis, development and editing of HACCP plans, and reassessments and validations of the plan has gone through a HACCP course to completion. The regulation states, the individual performing the functions listed in paragraph A of this section shall have successfully completed a course of instruction in the application of the 7 HACCP principles to meat, poultry, or egg products processing, including a segment of the development of a HACCP plan for a specific product and on record review. So now we have discussed the big parts of the HACCP system. We have discussed SSOPs, GMPs, and the 7 principles of HACCP. We are going to move on to the other components of a food safety plan. Defense. Food defense is a voluntary program currently. It is implemented to protect food products from contamination or adulteration intended to cause public health harm or economic disruption. As the time of this basic HACCP presentation is published, a food defense plan is not required by regulation. However, many facilities do opt to have one on file. FSIS has a template for a food defense plan, and you can fill out by visiting the link on the screen. Humane handling is a part of a food safety system that isn't necessarily food safety, but is still just as important in livestock slaughter facilities. The humane handling of livestock is regulated by 9 CFR 313. Typical items addressed in a humane handling program are transportation, unloading, movement, live animal holding, stunning, and exsanguination of livestock. FSIS has what is called a robust humane handling program, voluntary program, where a facility that slaughters animals can meet certain requirements. There is a difference between a basic humane handling program and a robust humane handling program. For the sake of this training, we just want you to know that there are procedures required to be in place for humane handling. Moving on, a Listeria control program is the next program that is related to the HACCP plan. Note, rather than having a Listeria control plan, you may decide to have a CCP at the further production or packaging step instead of this extra program. This program is specific to meat processing facilities that process ready-to-eat products. Examples of ready-to-eat products would be jerky, country-cured ham, pre-cooked ready-to-heat convenience meals, roast beef sandwiches, etc. Listeria, or more specifically, Listeria monocytogenes, is a biological hazard in these ready-to-eat products, and there must be some control for it. 9 CFR Part 430 is the regulatory reference for Listeria control. Listeria monocytogenes is a pathogen that can lead to a very serious illness in humans, which makes it very important to control in an environment, and it can be virtually everywhere. Recall plans are programs required by 9 CFR 418. Specifically, 9 CFR 418.3 states, each official establishment must prepare and maintain written procedures for the recall of any meat, meat food, poultry, or poultry product produced and shipped by the official establishment. These written procedures must specify how the official establishment will decide whether to conduct a product recall and how the establishment will affect the recall should it decide that one is necessary. This is a program that is needed to be in place before product is ever shipped to ensure proper procedures are followed in the event of a recall. A recall team should be made up of employees from different departments in the facility. These may include any employees from maintenance, retail, sanitation, packaging, processing, maybe office personnel, and any owners, but the team doesn't have to include these specifically, or you may opt to add more than those listed. And wrapping up, there are requirements to know about in relation to record keeping. All documents reviewed should have a minimum of a signature and a date. FSIS requires retention of the records under 9 CFR 417.5E, where slaughter records are required to be kept a minimum of 1 year, refrigerated product records must be kept a minimum of 1 year, and frozen, preserved, or shelf-stable products must be kept a minimum of 2 years. Note that most facilities aim to keep all records at a minimum of 2 years to avoid confusing the requirements here. As you look at developing your food safety system, listed here are resources that may help in doing so. The 2018 Meat and Poultry Hazards Guide is a great resource when building your hazard analysis to help identify what hazards may be applicable at each processing step. The FSIS Listeria Compliance Guideline from 2014 is a tool to use when developing your Listeria control program for ready-to-eat products. Further, FSIS has many resources on their website to aid in developing a food safety system. Wrapping up this presentation, we summarize the importance of why food safety systems need to be implemented. First, without them, there would be no standard for the production of safe and high-quality food. This in turn means that consumers would never know what they are buying and eating, or if the product would make them ill or worse. At this time, pause this video. It is recommended that students be provided the previous slides to study before taking the following quiz. Participants who just watched this video should be provided a piece of paper and a pen, and cell phones, smartwatches, or other electronic devices should be put away. 10 questions will follow this slide. These questions will be numbered 1 through 10. These questions will be a combination of multiple choice or fill in the blank. It is recommended that once a slide transitions to the question, that the video is paused until the students answer the question. The video then can be resumed where the student will view the next question. There will be a slide after the 10th question that states answers. Another person shall review the student's answers against the answers on the screen. It is recommended a 90% or 9 out of 10 questions be answered correctly for the student to pass this quiz. Remember, this presentation is meant to provide a student the basic understanding of a food safety system. This course is not certified by the HACCP Alliance and cannot be used as an official HACCP certification. We are going to be moving on to question 1. Question 1. What does the HA stand for in HACCP? Is it A, humane animals, B, hazard analysis, C, hormones and antibiotics, or D, health association? Question 2. What is the 6th principle of HACCP? Question 3. What is not an example of a critical control point? Is it A, pH? Is it B, color? Is it C, temperature? Or is it D, weather? Question 4. What do the letters SSOP stand for? Question 5. PILLSBURY, NATICK Army Lab, and NASA all created blank, originally a risk management system for food during space exploration. Question 6. What is the second principle of HACCP? Question 7. In HACCP Principle 7, which tasks are typically done first? Validation or verification? Question 8. Who would not be included on a company's recall team? Would it be A, the packaging manager, B, the office manager, C, a sanitation employee, or D, customers? Question 9. What is the main hazard associated with ready-to-eat product? And question 10. What is an example of a chemical hazard? Is it A, listeria, B, salmonella, C, sanitizers, or D, rust? That concludes the quiz portion of this presentation. If a student is missing an answer to a question, do not proceed until all questions are answered. We are going to be moving on to answers of the quiz. Question 1, what does the HA stand for in HACCP? The answer is B, hazard analysis. Question 2, what is the sixth principle of HACCP? And that is establish record-keeping procedures. Question 3, what is not an example of a critical control point? The answer is D, weather. Question 4, what do the letters SSOP stand for? SSOP stands for Sanitation Standard Operating Procedures. Question 5, PILLSBURY, NATICK Army Lab, and NASA all created blank, originally a risk management system for food during space exploration. The answer is they've created HACCP, the hazard analysis and critical control point. Question 6, what is the second principle of HACCP? The second principle of HACCP is identify critical control points. Question 7, in HACCP Principle 7, which tasks are typically done first, validation or verification? The answer is validation. Question 8, who would not be included on a company's recall team? The answer is D, customers. What is the main hazard associated with ready-to-eat product? The answer is Listeria monocytogenes. What is an example of a chemical hazard? The answer is C, sanitizers. On the screen here is an example of an employee training form that you can utilize to keep track of this basic HACCP training. If there are any questions, please call AMP at 717-367-1168 or email us at amp@amp.com.